So for each week of the Relevant series in this portion where we're focusing on Jesus for about, I think, 10 or 12 weeks, every message has a title. So we had Jesus and blessing, Jesus and treasure, Jesus and prayer, Jesus and Lazarus. So this morning, the message is titled Jesus and Doubt. And doubt comes in all shapes and sizes. And there's definitely kind of categories of doubt. One category of doubt is what I would call intellectual doubts, right? And this is, some of an intellectual doubt would be like, did the Bible really happen? I mean, there's a lot of crazy stories in there. Moses hits a rock and water comes out and a 90-year-old woman gives birth and there's a talking donkey and people come back from the dead. I mean, there's some kind of crazy stuff in there. So you go, is that all really true? Or you may even have questions about the existence of God. Like, is God real? Like, how can you really know that God's real? Or maybe God isn't real and things that we don't understand, we just say, well, God did that, right? And those are intellectual doubts. Or there may be the question of like, well, who created God? And we have these things that run through our brains. There's another category of doubts, which I would term as theological doubts. And this is like, along this lines is, the idea that, there's all of these religions, right? There's like Muslim and Christian and Jewish and Islam. And there's all these different things, Hindu and Sikh. And it's like, how do you know which one is true? And well, maybe they're all true, or maybe they're all wrong. And we have these kind of theological doubts. Well, how is it that Christianity can say that Jesus is the only way to God? Like, that seems a little bit narrow, a little bit restrictive. Or why are there so many denominations? Like, there's 1,000 denominations. And so maybe this whole Christianity thing is just made up by men. And if I can get enough followers, then I get to call myself a denomination or a church. And then there's theological issues surrounding Jesus. Did he really rise from the dead? Or did he just, die and people made this story up to kind of build this new sect of Judaism, which we now call Christianity? And Jesus dying on the cross, like, how can that pay for the sins of everybody? So we have these doubts. And there's another category of doubts which would center around kind of our heart and our lives and a little bit more personal. If God is all-powerful, then why doesn't he do something about this ongoing war in Ukraine? Why didn't he stop the wildfires that killed thousands and destroyed all these trees and buildings in Hawaii? Or the flooding that happened in Libya just recently and that killed thousands? Why didn't he do anything about that if he's all-powerful? And if God is all-loving, why doesn't he answer my prayers? Like, why didn't he heal my grandmother? Why did my friend's child die of cancer? Why was my friend or my cousin killed by a drunk driver? That doesn't seem very loving for God to not step in there. Or maybe it's more personal. You've been fighting an addiction for years and you've lost more often than you've won, but you've prayed about it. Or you face anxiety or depression on a daily basis. Or maybe your marriage is crumbling and you've asked God, fix my marriage, help my marriage, fix us, and it doesn't get better. And you go, why doesn't God step into this? That's a pretty big list of doubts, right? And if you didn't have doubts when you walked in, and now you got them. Like, thanks, wasn't thinking about that 20 minutes ago, and now my mind is racing. I'm not sure I believe this whole Jesus thing, right? But they're there. So here's the question. Is what do we do with our doubts? Is God okay that we have doubts? Is God disappointed in us that we have doubts? Are we supposed to just take our doubts and just stuff it and pretend they don't exist? There's some people who say, God says it, I believe it, that settles it, no doubting. Is that how we're all supposed to try and deal with the doubts in our lives? I know for me, I struggle with doubt. I have doubts. And it's not like I go looking for doubts, like, oh, let me see if I can find something to kind of doubt my faith. I don't go looking for it. I think it's just a little bit the way that I'm wired, that I tend to be kind of skeptical about life and things that happen, and that wiring carries over, at least for me, into faith to an extent. And I have this kind of skepticism and this doubt. And I know people, and maybe this is you, and God bless you if this is you, but like I do know people who have virtually no doubts. They're like, it's all good. That stuff never crosses my mind, and I'm kind of envious of people like that. But the fact is, I also know that I have a living and vibrant and life-giving faith, even though I have these doubts. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at a passage in Mark chapter 9. And it's a story about Jesus interacting with this fellow, and they're interacting in part about the doubts that he has, and how does he react, and how does Jesus react in terms of the doubts that he has. So if you have your Bible, open up to Mark chapter 9. So to set this a little bit in the timeline, Jesus has been on the Mount of Transfiguration, and with him has been kind of the inner circle of his disciples of Peter, James, and John. And so they come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and this is the scene they come to. This is chapter 9, verse 14. It says, when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them, and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed, and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, what are you arguing about? So Jesus arrives in this scene. There's all kinds of people around. There's the disciples, there's people who are sick, there's also the scribes who are they're skeptics as well of who Jesus is, the religious people. So you have all this mixture of people, and there's an argument going on. And so Jesus steps into this argument and asks, what are you arguing about? Verse 17 says, and someone from the crowd answered him, Jesus, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. So there's this dad, and he has his son, it says, possessed by an evil spirit, and it throws him into these seizures, maybe these epileptic types of seizures. And he's kind of at his wit's end, like, I don't know what to do. If you have children, you know this, that the pain that you see your child going through is so much worse most of the time than pain that you go through. That you wish, like, if I could just trade places with my son, I would do that, and I would take that pain for him. And I think that's the sense that the father has here. He's just in this agony because his son keeps having these seizures, and it's dangerous for him. You know, last week, if you were here, I talked about how my son Ben had to have an IV put in it at the ER. And I wept for him, and I wanted to trade places if I could. And you get that sense here that the father is just desperate because his son is in pain. Then in verse 22, it says, but if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. So Jesus says to the Father, all things are possible for one if you believe. Now, here's the question. What do you do if you are the Father and you have doubts like I do, or doubts like you do? Because Jesus said, if you believe, then I can heal him. But what do you do if you don't believe 100%? You're like, I think you could, but I'm not really sure. What do you do? I mean, do you kind of give the answer, well, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, I have faith? Do you just kind of say that, even if it's not true? What do you do in that situation? Well, the Father, like us, was mixed with faith and doubt, and this is what he says. Immediately, the Father cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. I love that line. I believe, help my unbelief. You see, the Father expresses what I think exists in many of us. Is I believe, I have faith, But in there is a mixture of doubts. Help me with the doubts that I have. What I'm going to do over the rest of the message is I'm going to give us 4 steps to help us to deal with the doubt. And here's the first one, is know that faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is not the absence of doubt. You know, I think sometimes we are inclined to think, well, that if I have faith, then I have no doubt at all. But we see in this man that that's not true. He says, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, help me in my doubts. If you're a person who struggles with doubt, I want to encourage you this morning that it's okay to doubt. Because again, I say I'm one of those people, I struggle with doubt, but yet I walk closely with God, even though those doubts are there. But also notice what he doesn't say. He says, I believe, help my unbelief, but he doesn't say, I believe and I have doubts. Okay, and there's a subtle difference there, but it's important. In other words, he's saying, I have doubts, help me with my doubts, help me move forward. Right? He doesn't just say, I have them and let's just stay there. And I share that because part of what that means for him and for us is that I want to move forward. I want my faith to grow and my doubts to become less. I want my faith to grow and I want my doubts to become less. Then we go back to the story. It says this, verse 25. It says, when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. Jesus responds to the faith of the Father, even though his faith is mixed with faith and doubt. He didn't condemn the Father for not having 100% faith. He doesn't say, well, come back later when you have all faith and all of your doubt is gone. He doesn't say, sorry, Pops, don't have enough faith. Right? He doesn't say any of that. He says, I'm going to heal your son. He responds to this man's faith, even though it's an imperfect faith. We're going to come back to this, I believe, help my unbelief for in just a minute. But I do want to pause and not miss the main point of this story, which is this man and the faith that he did have changed his son's life forever and changed his life forever as well. He no longer had to worry about his son being thrown into these seizures. He no longer had to worry about his son throwing himself into a fire or into water. He didn't have to worry about any of that anymore because Jesus had healed him. Jesus had changed his life forever. And I don't ever want us to forget about that healing touch that Jesus has that can change our lives forever. So here's the second step in dealing with doubt. Be honest about my doubts. That's exactly what the Father did in this story. He was honest about the doubts that he had. And he also said, help me in my unbelief. He didn't try and hide his doubts. He didn't say, hey, I believe it, that settles it, do your thing. He was honest about his doubts. And one of the things that I love about River Ridge and the culture and the people of River Ridge is that we are a church where you can be honest. We are a church where you can be real about who you are. We're not the kind of church where you got to come in and put on a happy face and pretend that you believe things that you don't believe. We're a church where you can ask tough questions, and that's okay, and to find answers and to seek answers. And so intellectually, you don't have to have everything together. In your life, you don't ever have to have everything together, because we're a church that says, let's be honest, and then let's let God deal with the junk and the doubt and the difficulty and the pain in our lives. And so the Father was honest about his doubts, just as we want to be honest. And he has those words, help me in my unbelief. And so when we are honest with our doubts, and there's definitely some benefits of that because we don't have to try and pretend and all the difficulty that comes with pretending to be something that we're not. But there's another great benefit when we recognize with our doubts, when we share with what our doubts are, we put them out there, and then we're free to seek answers. And that's the third step, is seek answers. Seek the answers to the doubts that you have. When I began the sermon a few minutes ago, I shared probably 10 or 15 doubts in that beginning section. And those doubts are not doubts that I read in a book somewhere, like, I didn't say, GPT chat, what doubts do people have? Like, those came from me. Like, those things have all rumbled through my heart and rumbled through my head from time to time, right? But what I have done over time is sought answers to that. So I've read books, I've listened to podcasts, I've read the scriptures, I've had conversations with people and asked people who are a little wiser, a little bit further along, hey, what do you think about this? How do you answer that? And I've sought answers to those. My life is not totally doubt-free, but those questions I have answers for, and I can work through them when they pop up in my head. And my life in terms of doubt now, as compared to 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, there's more faith and less doubt. It's not gone, and I still have to come back to those, but a big part of that is seeking out answers. On a practical side, I want to help you with that. I'm going to put a slide up here. I know some of you guys like to take out your phone and take a picture of that if you want to do that. But these are some great resources for you to find the answers to your doubts. So one of them is a website called Got Questions. If you come across something or something pops in your mind, type it in there, and they have a huge resource of answers. There's a couple books up there, Case for Faith and Case for Christ. Those are by a guy named Lee Strobel. He has more books than that. He probably has, 6 or 7 books. Those are 2 of his more popular ones. But you read those, and the chapter headings will help you to find the answers to your doubts. You should just kind of go in to read those chapters specifically. Another is Right Now Media. So if you are a part of River Ridge Church, you can go to our church website and you can get a subscription for free to Right Now Media. And there's all kinds of resources on there about the field, which is called apologetics, which is answering some of the intellectual questions about doubt. But you can go on there, get a free subscription, and just watch videos and search for the things that are kind of going through your brain. And then the other resource is Tim Keller wrote a book called Reason for God, which answers kind of those intellectual questions. And another one called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, and that answers more of those heart types of questions. So those are some resources for you if you want to delve into that. I want to give you one more step in dealing with doubt, and we're actually going to leave Mark and go to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6 says this. It says, "And without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." So this question the passage raises the question, what kind of faith is it that pleases God? Because without faith, we can't please God. So what kind of faith is it that pleases God? And we've already talked about it. It's not like you have to have this pure faith that never, ever, ever doubts, right? So it's another kind of faith that must please God. Now, in Hebrews chapter 11, there's those verses, and then what follows is what is sometimes called the Faith Hall of Fame. And there's a list of, 16, 20 people, how many verses, but it'll have this kind of repetition to it. And so it'll say, by faith, Noah built the ark. By faith, Abraham left his own country to a place he did not know. By faith, Moses' mother hid him in the reeds. By faith, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. By faith, the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, and on and on and on this list goes. But every one of those people, it says by faith, and then they did an action, right? And here's why I want you to see and understand with that, is those people had faith, not because they didn't doubt at all, because I think they probably did, but they had faith because they acted on their faith. That's what was commendable by God. That's what he's saying. A faith that pleases me is a faith that is acted upon. And as I think back through those characters, right, I can't help but think, I'm pretty sure they had some doubts along the way. I mean, if you look at the story, it's estimated that Noah spent about 50 to 75 years building this boat on dry land. It's like somewhere along the line, he was probably, this ain't gonna, what is going on here? I'm giving up, right? I'll go work in the tool shed and make a cabinet for my wife. You know, I mean, like, you wonder, like, you know, even if you look at the life of Moses, he had doubts. He expressed his doubts to God. Well, you're calling me to do this, but what if they don't follow me? Well, what if I don't speak eloquently? He expresses his doubts to God, but yet he does. He acts in faith. You think about the Israelites. They crossed the Red Sea. So the Red Sea parts, and they're walking across the Red Sea, right? And I don't know this, but I'm pretty sure. Like, I'm going to guess they had a pretty good jog going across the Red Sea, right? Like, I'm guessing they were not like, man, that's amazing. Look at that water all wall. Let's stay here. You know, I mean, there was a little bit of faith and doubt, I think, mixed in, and they were jogging it across there, right? It's there. But here's what I want us to see. The faith that pleases God is this, is when we act on our faith and not on our doubt. When we act on our faith and not on our doubt. In us, there's a mixture of this faith and doubt. And when that is there, we have a choice. Am I going to act on my faith or am I going to act on my doubt? I did a sermon on doubt a number of years ago. And before that sermon, I pulled up, I had people have cards, right? And I gave them cards and write your doubts. And I read a bunch of those. And I was looking through that sermon, and one of the doubts that people had, and this is kind of a practical one, I want to read it to you. It said, the doubt that I have is that God will provide a spouse for me, right? It was somebody who was single and was kind of struggling with, I doubt that God's going to provide a spouse for me. And so what does it look like if that's your doubt? How do you act on that, right? You might say, you know, in one sense, it could be like to act without faith. So I'm going to act on my doubt is like, well, I'm going to compromise my values. I'm going to just kind of give in and just settle for a spouse. Or to say, I believe God's going to provide a spouse, is to say, I'm going to trust that God will provide the right spouse at the right time. Or maybe the example of giving, right? It's about the action. Maybe you're thinking about giving and you're like, if I give to God first, am I going to have enough money at the end of the month? And maybe you're 55% faith and 45% doubt, right? And you go, okay, well, I'm going to act on faith and I'm going to give to God first. And one of the neat things that happens is when we act in faith instead of in doubt, our faith grows. So maybe you take that step, you go, okay, I'm going to give to God first. And you do that month after month, and you're like, God has provided for me. And now you're like, I'm 70% faith and 30% doubt, right? You say, well, I'm going to take another step, and instead of just giving to God first, I'm going to give a tithe. I'm going to give a full 10% of my income, and you take that step, right? And so my point is not like give more. I don't want you to get distracted by that. But my point is that when we act on faith, it increases the faith that we have, and it decreases the doubts that we have because God comes through time and time again. I want to close by sharing a final story about what it looks like to act in faith when you're not 100% certain, right? So this is a story from the book of Daniel, and there's these three guys. Their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? But if you grew up watching VeggieTales, you know them better as Rack, Shack, and Benny, right? So Rack, Shack, and Benny, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The king, King Nebuchadnezzar, has built this huge statue. And he says, everybody must bow and worship this statue. But these three men, probably boys, really teenagers, believe in God. And they're like, we're not bowing to that idol. And they say, anybody that doesn't bow is going to be thrown into this furnace. And so they put the idol up and they don't bow. And they're brought before King Nebuchadnezzar. And he asks them one final time, do you want to bow to this idol? And they have this really great response, and they say this. They say, our God is on page 8. Okay, so they say, it's not what they said. They said, our God is, there's nothing on this page. Who did that? Okay, but they say this. They say, our God will rescue us from the fiery furnace. But if he does not, we will still not bow to your idol. And I love that because they had faith that God would rescue them, but there was a little bit of doubt. But if he doesn't, we are still going to do the right thing. And I think that's an incredible example for us. That you have faith and you have doubt and you have a choice. Am I going to live and step and act on the faith part of me? Or am I going to live and act and step out and give in to my doubts? That's the question we have before us.